Good morning. I call to order the third meeting of the General Assembly's call to order. This meeting is held using remote and simultaneous interpretation. I kindly ask participants to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working remotely and of the increased likelihood of disruptions. The meeting will adjourn promptly at the scheduled closing, and there will be no extensions. Participants may select the preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the non option to hear the original language of the speakers. Speakers will not be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video until given the floor. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button above the microphone icon. If the problem persists, please reload your browser. For technical support, you may also send a private message to the moderator of the meeting. May I remind delegates that the interactive dialogues serve to pose questions and make comments directed at the presenters. The delivery of written statements is strongly discouraged. I would request that the interventions be brief and concise, and that any questions to the presenter be made at the start of the intervention, as the microphones will be automatically muted when the allotted speaking time has elapsed. I now invite the committee to turn to agenda item 72, entitled Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, and its sub-items A to D. I now invite the chair of the Committee Against Torture, Mr. Jens Modvig, to make an introductory statement. Mr. Modvig, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Chairperson, distinguished delegates, colleagues and friends. The past year has been extraordinary for the Committee Against Torture, as well as for the whole United Nations. The COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating the risk of ill treatment and torture worldwide, and thereby highlighting the need for a well-functioning and sufficiently funded treaty body system. Nevertheless, we have faced obstacles. As explained in the CAT annual report, the first and immediate consequence of the pandemic was in fact that the April-May 2020 session had to be cancelled due to COVID-19 related health risks and travel restrictions. The committee has faced a number of serious obstacles to conducting online work, such as the time difference between the locations of members of the committee, the need for a secure and well-functioning online platform, connectivity for all committee members and other entities regardless of their location, and proper interpretation in the working languages at all times. These issues have not been fully resolved despite the efforts of the Secretariat. Owing to these obstacles, the committee has not been in a position to carry out public activities such as the consideration of country dialogues and individual communications which require extensive and confidential exchanges between committee members with interpretation. CAT has addressed the increased risk of torture and ill treatment during the pandemic in a joint statement with the other UN anti-torture mechanisms on the International Day in support of victims of torture on 26 June. Further, the increased risk was highlighted at a webinar entitled Combating Torture and Ill Treatment in the COVID-19 Context, Testimonies from the Ground, which were organized by OHCHR and the Association for the Prevention of Torture. Reacting to the limitations posed by the pandemic, the committee decided to prolong its bureau until the next in-person session so as to enable proper consultations and elections. Exceptionally, it decided that its 3 new members, Mr. Huawen Liu from China, Mr. Erdogan Iskan from Turkey, and Ms. Ilvia Puse from Latvia, make their solemn declarations in writing and posting them on the CAT webpage so as to enable their full participation in the CAT work. In order to address any protection gap, CAT has continued some crucial activities, namely the discussions and adoption of its list of issues and list of issues prior to reporting, including with specific references to COVID-19, the processing of state reports as United Nations documents to be considered once the situation will enable a proper dialogue, the follow-up to its concluding observations, the preparation of its work under Article 20, which is the confidential inquiries, the registration of individual complaints, and not the least, the issuance of interim measures of protection. Under its reporting procedure under Article 19, as reflected in the annual report, CAT took measures for focusing the dialogue with state parties via a proper coordination with other treaty bodies when drafting its LOIPRs and limiting the number of questions, as well as when drafting its concluding observations. CAT has continued to strengthen its follow-up to concluding observations procedure. The necessity to protect those cooperating with CAT from reprisals remains a priority, and CAT has since the beginning been at the forefront by issuing specific detailed guidelines, endorsing the San Jose guidelines, appointing a rapporteur for reprisals, and having a public webpage on CAT activities on reprisals. Looking at what lies ahead, CAT is still very much engaged in the process to secure a well-functioning treaty body system. In order to address challenges which are common to most treaty bodies, such as the backlog of individual complaints, non-reporting and late reporting by many states, the harmonization of working methods, as well as the implications of the COVID-19, CAT has been actively engaged in both the treaty body chairpersons meetings, the 2020 treaty body review process, the newly created treaty bodies working group on the COVID-19, as well as providing substantive inputs to the co-facilitators of the 2020 treaty body review. We have been very pleased to see that many components of the chairperson's position paper are included in the co-facilitators report to the President of the General Assembly, such as a fixed calendar, reviews in the regions, additional meeting time, and necessary financial and human resources. Let me conclude by stressing that the success of the CAT monitoring of the Convention is directly linked to the constructive dialogue and cooperation with the state parties. Let me also pay tribute to the Convention Against Torture Initiative, CTI, a state-led initiative for the full ratification of the Convention and its implementation, as well as to national human rights institutions, national preventive mechanisms, and civil society, particularly the OMCT, coordinating NGOs' inputs to CAT work. Lastly, CAT work cannot be undertaken without the technical and substantive support of OHCHR via both the Secretariat of CAT, the Petitions Unit, and the Capacity Building Program. In that regard, and as recommended by all chairs of treaty bodies, it is necessary and urgent to increase the human and financial resources, not only to enable the daily work of CAT, but also to enable us to deal with the backlogs accumulated during the pandemic. Thank you very much.
I thank the Chair of the Committee Against Torture for his statement. I now open the floor for questions or comments to Mr. Modvig. As per past practice, I ask delegations to limit their comments to 2 to 3 minutes or less. Participants wishing to make comments and pose questions to the speaker are invited to use the dedicated speaker request form, which is accessible on the chat board of the Interprefy portal within the next 3 minutes, after which the list will be closed. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile. You have the floor.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We are grateful for the annual report of the CAT, which shows the valuable work done by this body and the difficulties encountered during this period. And we'd like to ratify Oman, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for recently ratifying the treaty. We'd like to thank these countries for coming closer to the universality of this document. The interpreter apologizes, the sound is breaking up. Interpretation must be discontinued.
La iniciativa contra la Convención contra la Tortura, conjuntamente con Dinamarca, con Fiji, Ghana, Indonesia y Marruecos, apoyando y promoviendo la ratificación e implementación universal de la Convención a 2024. La CTI aspira a fortalecer las instituciones políticas y prácticas para una gobernanza más digna y basada en normas y para reducir y prevenir los riesgos de tortura y malos tratos, en particular en los países en desarrollo, a través del diálogo, intercambio, asistencia técnica, apoyo, fortalecimiento de capacidades y fortalecimiento institucional, entre otros. Tras 6 años de esta iniciativa, hemos visto importantes progresos a nivel mundial en cuanto a la ratificación de este instrumento, pero también
Interpretation has been suspended due to bad sound.
que ya han ratificado la CAT, como bien señala el informe del comité. Finalmente, deseamos reiterar nuestro compromiso con la Convención contra la Tortura y su comité, y queremos hacer un llamado a aquellos estados que aún no han ratificado este instrumento a que se sumen a esta convención para alcanzar la anhelada meta de la universalidad de este importante instrumento internacional de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Agradezco al...
I thank the representative of Chile for your comments. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico. Mexico, you have the floor.
de México.
Mexico, are you there?
Bueno, estaríamos teniendo algunos problemas.
Very well. Well, we're having some problems connecting with the distinguished delegate of Mexico, so I give the floor now to the distinguished delegate of Russia.
Thank you.
We welcome the progress and like to thank the chair of the Committee Against Torture for the report. We note, as a whole, the great input the Committee Against Torture has made to prevent and eradicate torture around the world. Our comments pertain to the process of review of the effectiveness of human rights treaty bodies and a request to the committee in this connection. Resolution 268 gave not just one extra week to the Committee Against Torture, but a whole extra session. And money and time was allocated for this purpose, for a specific purpose to address the backlog in their consideration of national reports. Nevertheless, this backlog is still there at the Committee Against Torture. More, it is also surprising to see that with an extra third session, the overall number of reports that have been considered by the committee remains the same number as when they had only 2 sessions a year. We can only explain this by the fact that the committee is using the specific time that has been allocated to them for other functions that have not been agreed upon by member states. So we believe that this is an acceptable approach, particularly given from the point of view of the Convention. I'd also like to note that this conduct of the Committee Against Torture does not allow us to automatically enact paragraphs 26 to 28 of UN General Assembly Resolution 68268 on the formula for calculating the time and necessary resources for the committee. We are not ready to give a green light to an automatic extension of this formula. We hope that the committee will bear in mind existing realities, including financial realities, and take another look, an objective look at its work programme, and will bring this work programme in line with the requirements of the Convention. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for your comments, and now I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Bueno, estaríamos teniendo algunos.
Very well. Well, we're having some problems at the moment. We'll solve them soon. So I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. You have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. The EU is strongly committed to the fight against torture and ill treatment. We appreciate the opportunity to engage today with all three important actors within the field of fighting and preventing the use of torture and ill treatment globally. Mr. Modvich, the EU would like to thank you, your fellow committee members and your staff for all your work in supporting states to improve the implementation of the Convention Against Torture. We are pleased to see that the number of ratifications continues to increase. State parties reporting to the committee is crucial for the implementation of the Convention in the state party and the ability of the committee to carry out its function of monitoring that implementation. The EU acknowledges the amount of work both state parties and the committee conduct in connection with the state parties' obligation to submit periodic reports. Thus, the EU wants to thank you for implementing the simplified reporting procedure. We would like to ask you this question, Mr. Mosvik. What is your assessment of the simplified reporting procedure? I thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of the European Union for those comments. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Czech Republic. You have the floor.
Bueno, estaríamos teniendo.
Well, we seem to be having some problems there, so I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico, if you were able to connect. So we give you the floor now. Madam Chair, Vice Chair, sir, thank you very much. So let me resume. Mexico would like to thank the committee, the chair of the Committee Against Torture, Mr. Jens Mogvik, for participating in this third committee. We regret the fact that the 69th session of the committee was not able to be concluded due to the situation brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mexico takes note of the activities of the committee, and we reiterate our commitment to work together to ensure the guarantee, respect for, promotion and protection of human rights of all persons, in particular in fighting torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. We'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to have been able to share with members of the committee the actions being taken by the government of Mexico to address the priority recommendations contained in the final observations issued by this committee after the presentation of our 7th periodic report. Mexico welcomes the observations and recommendations issued by the committee, and we reiterate our commitment to address them and continue to inform you with regard to follow-up. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact in all fields. My delegation would be interested to know the best practices that the committee has identified in order to protect human rights and prevent torture or inhumane treatment, as curfews and social distancing measures are being implemented, particularly in detention centres. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for your contribution, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark. You have the floor.
Quisiera recordarles a todos los
I'd like to recall to all participants that once you've been given the floor, you have to press the orange button to ensure that we can get the audio and video for you on the platform. We seem to be experiencing some difficulties with this. It's because delegates are not activating this orange button. So please do use this tool because it will enable you to participate. So now we're going to continue with the next speaker, and we give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Czech Republic, whilst we're trying to connect again with Denmark, the Czech Republic.
Bueno, estimados colegas.
Well, distinguished colleagues, we still have some technical difficulties with Denmark and Czech Republic. So I give the floor now to the distinguished chair of the Committee Against Torture so that he can respond to the comments that have already been made. You have the floor, sir.
Time to process all the individual communications prepared by the Secretariat. As for the question by the EU on our assessment of the simplified reporting procedure, I must say that we still consider this as a great success, which is an advantage both for the committee and for the state parties reporting. Out of our 170 state parties, 105 have accepted the simplified reporting procedures, and more do. Interestingly, in connection with the implementation of the predictable or fixed calendar, which could represent a capacity problem to many committees, we consider that the simplified reporting procedures could be very helpful. One of the models we have been discussing in the committee is alternating between a full review in Geneva and a focused review in the region or even in the country, following a 5-year reporting cycle. This would allow us to put forward a list of issues prior to reporting, very focused before the focused review, maybe just comprising 5 or 10 issues, and then request a report from the state party on these focused issues. So we do see that apart from being an advantage in general, the simplified reporting procedure could also be a very useful solution in implementing the predictable calendar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair of the Committee Against Torture, for your participation. And I now invite Mr. Malcolm Evans, the chair of the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, to make an introductory statement. You have the floor.
Madam Chair, this is the 10th and indeed the last occasion on which I will be addressing you concerning the work of the SPT, and it is certainly the strangest and in some ways the most challenging. Updating you on our visiting programme since we met here last year is relatively simple, as no visits by the SPT have actually been able to take place, and let me be clear why. It is because of the failure of the UN to provide the funds necessary to permit us to carry out our convention mandate. We fully understand the limitations on our work brought about by necessary restrictions resulting from COVID-19. However, our inability to undertake our work in visiting places of detention for the last 12 months is not just because of such restrictions. Our visits were cancelled in the last quarter of 2019 and could not be undertaken in the beginnings of the first quarter of 2020 because there was no money available to pay for them. The SPT was the only human rights treaty body whose work was directly affected by what we could call the 2019 financial crisis for the Office of the High Commissioner in this way. In the meanwhile, of course, under the OPCAT system, national preventive mechanisms have, fortunately, been able to continue to undertake their preventive work, including visits to places of detention in many countries around the world, and have continued to be able to do so despite the pandemic. The European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, a body similar to ours operating within Europe, has also been able to recommence its programme of visiting places of detention despite the pandemic. Whilst we, as the SPT, realise that it is not currently possible to undertake our work of visiting exactly as before, we do not think there is any reason why we ought not to be able to exercise our visiting mandate in some form at all. And as things currently stand, the reason that we cannot is not really COVID, it is cash. Against that background, of course, the SPT supports exploring innovative ways of fulfilling its mandate. Indeed, we were the first, I believe, of the human rights treaty bodies to hold and complete a full treaty body session online in June of 2020, which included a very successful online states parties meeting. I believe the extent of our use of electronic means to connect with others is arguably unrivaled within the treaty body system at the moment. And the SPT has been fully engaged with the 2020 review of the treaty body system as a whole, mandated by Resolution 68268. There is, however, an important element of the emerging review that needs to be properly contextualized as far as the work of the SPT is concerned as we look to the future. And these are proposals for what has been termed a digital shift. And I should like to quote a passage from my address to you, in fact, last year, words spoken before the COVID-19 pandemic and before the idea of a digital shift had arisen from the reports arising out of the treaty strengthening process. Last year, I said to you the following, and I quote, "One thing, however, is completely obvious. You cannot visit a place of detention remotely. The entire point of the OPCAT system is that it allows SBT members access to closed places where persons are deprived of their liberty, to interview detainees and staff, to see the conditions of detention, and to learn from those who work in detention and justice systems what happens in practice. This just cannot be done from afar. It is just impossible." I make no claims to be clairvoyant, but these words were, as it turns out, prescient. The visiting work of the SBT cannot take place remotely, and whatever the future may hold for the treaty body system as a whole, the SBT's future work must remain focused on the field. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the necessity of preventive visiting to places of detention clearer than ever. Many detention systems are chronically overcrowded, greatly magnifying the risk of transmitting the virus. Some states have responded to this by taking emergency measures to reduce their prison populations and mitigating this risk. Others have done little or nothing, while some have even manipulated early release schemes to allow those imprisoned for human rights violations to be released, while continuing to hold those convicted of relatively minor offences. Most states have introduced draconian restrictions on external access to places of detention, in effect, largely cutting detainees off from the outside world. Again, while some countries have mitigated the worst effects of this by providing alternative means of communication with families and friends, many others have not. The effect on the well-being of detainees has been profound. The truth is that states were swift to impose restrictions within places of detention, slow to put in place measures to mitigate the effects of this, and, it seems, putting detainees at the back of the queue when it comes to consider easing limitations. Against this background, the role of the national preventive mechanisms under the OPCAT system has never been more important. The SBT issued an advice earlier this year concerning the response to the pandemic by both states and national preventive mechanisms. We have been in frequent contact with our national mechanisms to encourage them to continue in their work as best they can and to ensure that they are able to do so. Many national preventive mechanisms have responded positively to the challenge, finding new ways of working in order to ensure there is oversight of places of detention at this time. But I regret to say some states have taken advantage of the pandemic to restrict the work of NPMs unnecessarily, seeking to deny them access to places of detention or even permission to travel at all. We consider the work of national preventive mechanisms to be an essential service which cannot be subject to general restrictions. Another issue which has arisen is whether places of quarantine are places of detention for the purposes of the optional protocol. Let me take this opportunity to answer this clearly. They are, and access cannot be denied to them on the basis that they are not. More generally, we have seen states being able to do some positive things, which they had previously said were impossible, such as dramatically reducing prison populations to reduce overcrowding. Some countries have also dramatically reduced the numbers held in immigration detention. There has been a growth in the use of non-custodial sentencing. These are important and positive systemic developments that have been able to be undertaken quickly and positively in the light of the situations that we now find ourselves in. But there are also another side to this coin. For example, increasing delays in the criminal justice system, meaning that some states are holding pre-trial detainees for much longer than they ought, or even extending the periods which under the law in which they can be held, and much more besides. Against this background, it is more important than ever that states parties to the OPCAT designate their national preventive mechanisms in a timely fashion. There are currently 90 states parties, of which 68 have designated their national mechanisms, but 21 are not in compliance with their obligations to do so. Of these 21, 14 are now more than 3 years overdue in establishing their mechanism, and half of these, 7, are over 10 years late. This is unacceptable. The establishment of independent, effective national mechanisms is vital, not only for compliance with OPCAT obligations, but for effective prevention of torture and ill treatment. Returning to the SPT, even whilst we were unable to undertake our visiting programme, there is and remains much that we can do and should be doing in supporting the work of national mechanisms at this time. Our work in doing so, however, and I regret to say, has been further handicapped by the reduction in the size of our secretariat during the current year. Our complement of professional staff is now the same as it was 12 years ago, when we had about half the number of states parties and only a fraction of the work that we have to handle today. Yet despite all this, there are so many positives that have come out of the OPCAT system. And during the lifetime of the SPT, a global network, schooled and skilled in the techniques of prevention, has grown to maturity. More is known than ever before about the shocking realities of the terrible ways in which detainees are treated in far too many states around the world. And inevitably, this includes states who are at this meeting here today. And it also includes many states who, frankly, dare to complain about the costs of the UN human rights system, whilst caring, it seems, not at all about the cost paid by those who are the victims of those human rights abuses. Ultimately, states are asked to pay in cash. The detainees are made to pay with pain. The purpose of the OPCAT system, of the SPT and of the NPMs is really very simple. It is to do all it can to prevent torture. It is, in fact, a terrible responsibility. But whatever it takes, the SPT and the national mechanisms within the OPCAT framework will continue to seek to find ways of doing so. A fuller statement outlining our work across the year and our annual report have, of course, been circulated to everyone. And let me now thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans, for your statement. As per past practice, I ask delegations to limit their comments to 2 to 3 minutes or less. Participants wishing to make comments and pose questions to the speaker are invited to use the dedicated speaker request form accessible on the chat board of the Interprefy portal within the next 3 minutes, after which the list will be closed. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark. Denmark, you have the floor.
Dinamarca tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Professor Evans, Denmark wishes to extend a wholeheartedly thanks to you both and the dedicated members of SPT. We note with great appreciation the ever-increasing number of state parties to the optional protocol. Ratifying the optional protocol is an important part in the fight against the prevention of torture. However, Denmark finds it worrying that several states are significantly overdue with their obligations under Article 17 to establish national preventive mechanisms. In this regard, we would like to ask you, Mr. Evans, the following question. Has the SPT identified any general issues that may prove as significant obstacles for states to comply with their obligations under Article 17? Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark for joining us and your contribution. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would also like to thank Sir Michael Evans for his presentation. Madam Chair, Brazil remains fully engaged in preventing and combating torture in the country. In response to the current COVID-19 pandemic, we have taken concrete actions to protect the health and integrity of persons deprived of liberty in the country. At the outset of the pandemic outbreak, the National Council of Justice issued recommendations to courts and judges with the aim of reducing the prison population, promoting preventive healthcare procedures, and regulating prison visits. Likewise, the Ministry of Justice published comprehensive guidelines to protect the health and safety of people deprived of their liberty during the crisis. Brazil is committed to ensuring that its national system to prevent torture has the necessary means and resources to implement its mandate. As a federate state of continental size facing different conditions and challenges across diverse regions, we believe it is important to count on specific mechanisms at the state level to prevent and combat torture. Unfortunately, today, only a minority of the states have such dedicated institutions. To address such shortcomings, the federal government has further engaged with the states with a view to expanding the network of institutions across the country. We believe that the reforms currently in implementation at the federal level should facilitate this process and contribute to the consolidation of a more decentralized and effective system. We hope to expand our discussions with the subcommittee in the upcoming video conference to be held this year. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias al distinguido.
Thank you very much to the distinguished representative of Brazil for your participation. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, Switzerland would like to thank the chair of the subcommittee for his presentation. Switzerland welcomes the increasing numbers of states party to the optional protocol and the improvement of its implementation at the national level. Studies show that visits to detention facilities is an effective way of preventing torture and inhuman treatment, which has a positive impact on society in its entirety. Nonetheless, because of COVID-19, visits to detention facilities is no longer possible, or only possible in a limited measure in some countries. Visits to detention facilities are crucial, especially in the current climate, to ensure the effective protection of detainees. Chair of the subcommittee, sir, I'd like to put two questions to you. Firstly, how does the subcommittee help authorities of states parties to deal with the pandemic? Secondly, what are the expectations of this subcommittee vis-a-vis the authorities of the states parties in the current situation? Switzerland would like to thank the members of the subcommittee for their commitment and the excellent quality of their work. Thank you.
La representante.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for your statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. EU, you have the floor.
Thank you. The European Union would like to welcome the important work of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture and your chairmanship, Professor Evans. The work of the subcommittee is imperative in strengthening the prevention of torture, and we are pleased to see that the number of state parties to OPCAT is increasing. The subcommittee's monitoring of places of detention is crucial to prevent the use of torture and ill treatment. With the spread of the coronavirus, the conditions for people in places of detention have become increasingly challenging, which emphasizes the need for independent monitoring. On the other hand, the pandemic has made monitoring even more difficult or even impossible. So the EU would like to ask you, Professor Evans, has the subcommittee considered alternative ways to fulfill its important mandate, seeing that all its planned monitoring visits of 2020 have been cancelled due to the pandemic? I thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union for your statement, and I'll give the floor to the chair of the subcommittee on prevention of torture, Mr. Evans, to respond to the comments or questions posed. Mr. Evans, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your remarks, observations, and your questions, and let me briefly respond to them. Several of you mentioned the increasing number of states parties. We are now standing at 90, which is a little short of half the global community. This is an excellent number, but let me, of course, reiterate that we wish that there were still many more. There is a long way to go before we have much fuller participation within the OPCAT system. And I take this opportunity to stress that as a committee, we do make ourselves available in order to talk to both signatory states and indeed those who may be thinking of signing or ratifying the OPCAT to learn a little bit more about what the implications of OPCAT membership are. One of the reasons we do this is indeed to address directly one of the first questions that the distinguished representative of Denmark raised concerning barriers to the establishment of the national preventive mechanisms. We do understand that establishing a national preventive mechanism can be a rather challenging, challenging thing to do. And so we are very anxious to engage with states as early as possible on their OPCAT journey in order to try to help them understand what is required of them and what assistance we can give them in doing so. We have produced a great many guides with the Office of the High Commissioner, with many others, and we are quite skilled at lending our expertise to assist states as they look at the options for establishing national mechanisms. We are quite clear, we do not dictate to the states, how can we? We cannot, what it is that the state should put in place, but we can advise on what in our experience works well, what doesn't work so well, and work alongside the state in trying to bring this about as quickly as possible. And we have done that successfully with very many of our states' parties, as many will attest. And so what are the real hurdles? Frankly, some states just seem unwilling to engage with us and move matters forward swiftly. I think, if I'm being honest, some seem to have been surprised, despite having ratified the convention, of the need to take this additional step, and just seem unwilling to really engage with the exercise, perhaps as they ought. It can be a complex matter, particularly in federal countries. To give an example, and I shall, as our colleague from Brazil just mentioned a few moments ago, but perhaps, and perhaps surprisingly, what I find is being the most difficult barrier is that some states try to overthink what is necessary, making it seem more complicated to establish the mechanism than is in fact the case. I'm not ignorant of the legislative and organizational complexities of doing it, but it is actually not as difficult to put something in place as some seem to think. And so I think, again, drawing on our experience, a willingness to engage, not overthinking the complexities and just seeing it as something that is, if 68 countries around the world have achieved it, the others can. And it would be great if those who have successfully do so gave encouragement and support to those who are struggling for these different reasons to do so. The colleague from Brazil clearly drew attention to some of the difficulties that all countries have to wrestle with in the light of the pandemic, but also rightly emphasized the importance of having an effective network of national preventive mechanisms, and in a federal country in particular, both at a state and at a federal level. He also mentioned that we are in the process of engaging with Brazil over questions about how best to configure national preventive mechanisms and support them at the state level. Changes have been made of late at the federal level, which he will be aware have caused some concern in some quarters, and we are looking forward to engaging with Brazil in order to see how we can best ensure that the national mechanisms, which I understand and appreciate that they are anxious to see established more broadly across the country, do so on a basis which maximizes their operational effectiveness. So we are looking forward to that conversation. I've already mentioned, some of the questions about how we help states parties. Switzerland asked about what some of the expectations should be for of states parties in times of the of the pandemic. The first thing that we would stress is that some states have frankly taken the opportunity to say that national mechanisms just cannot visit places of detention. There is no reason why this should be the case. Many countries still allow such visits, but obviously subject to necessary limitations on restrictions from an operational point of view, reflecting the realities of the places of detention themselves. What in our experience is required is a conversation between those trying to effect the monitoring and those responsible for the running of the place in a constructive way, understanding the parameters of what each needs to achieve to find ways in which it can be done. And there is experience in very many countries that this has proven entirely possible and operates very satisfactorily. And indeed, one of the unexpected outcomes of this is in a number of countries, relationships between those running places of detention, the national authorities and the national mechanisms have become stronger as a result of this, because they have come better to understand the constraints under which each works, but also what each is trying to achieve. And so there are positives there. Our key expectation of states parties, however, is simply to do their utmost to support NPMs in the independent exercise of their mandates and look to see how they can create the space for them to fulfill their mandate rather than seek to find means of restricting them in its exercise. It is a question of attitude. And where the attitude is positive, much can be done. Which brings me finally to the question from the European Union. Partly I will have already answered this. You have asked, though, whether the SPT has been considering alternative ways of undertaking its work. Well, we have certainly intensified our engagement with national preventive mechanisms and supporting them in that way. In terms of our own direct visiting places of detention, so far we have explored various options. We know we will not be able to do so in the manner in which we have been doing it now, but we should be able to use smaller delegations, local delegations, maybe draw on more local office support from OHCHR offices to cut down on the necessity of travel. It is possible to collect a lot more data and information remotely and in advance of visits. We are finding there are some things that previously we did in the context of a visit that could be done by way of remotely and through preparation, but having explored options, the one thing that we cannot do is effectively speak to detainees in confidence without getting close to them, without being in situ. So the short answer is we have indeed been exploring alternative ways. We think we are learning lessons that will be beneficial when we return to the new normal. But there are a core of activities that can only be done in the way that they have traditionally been done, and we look forward to returning to those as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias al señor Evans por...
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans, for your participation in this debate. Now, I invite the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment, Mr. Niels Menser, to deliver an introductory statement. You have the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen. Today, 75 years after the establishment of the United Nations, hardly any human right commands as much consensus as the absolute prohibition of torture. In reality, however, torture and ill-treatment continue to be practiced with impunity throughout the world. The stark discrepancy between the universal prohibition and the worldwide complacency with such abuse is not a singular phenomenon, but highlights a more generalized gap between the declared ambitions and the actual practice of human rights protection. In fact, the persistent failure of the international community to eradicate torture and ill-treatment exemplifies the broader incapacity of contemporary governance systems to fulfill the promises of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In response to this sobering reality, my newest report takes a step back from the usual legal and policy discourse and explores the phenomenon of torture and ill-treatment from the scientific perspective of neurobiology and social psychology. Overall, the resulting findings strongly suggest that the root cause for the persistent complacency with torture and ill treatment is not primarily a lack of expertise, resources, or normative consensus, nor generalized malicious intent, but lies in neurobiological and psychosocial factors that have shaped human decision-making throughout history. Most notably, contrary to the presumptions of rationality, morality, and public interest which underlie modern statehood, most human decision-making, in fact, remains guided by largely unconscious emotional impulses, pursues perceived short-term self-interest, and is consciously rationalized only ex post facto. This also applies to complex collective decision-making processes such as democratic elections, political appointments, judicial oversight, media reporting, and even the formation of public opinion more generally. Human self-interest has multiple aspects, including self-preservation, self-determination, self-affirmation, self-justification, and self-gratification. In normal circumstances, the natural human pursuit of self-interest will be expressed in line with surrounding moral and legal order. However, when distorted by excessive fear, pathological dysfunction, or experiences of trauma, perceived self-interest can trigger serious human rights violations which are irreconcilable with universally recognized legal and moral norms. In such situations, both perpetrators and bystanders tend to suppress the resulting moral dilemmas through largely unconscious patterns of self-deception and, in particular, through denial of fact, denial of responsibility, or denial of wrongfulness. Clearly, as a matter of law, such patterns of denial cannot under any circumstances justify torture or ill treatment. As neurobiological and psychosocial patterns of self-deception, however, they severely impair the ability and willingness of political leaders, judges, officials, the media, and even the general public to accurately perceive and act upon allegations of official misconduct. By distorting perceptions of reality, narratives of self-deception and denial can corrupt and neutralize even sophisticated frameworks for the prevention and prosecution of torture and ill treatment, thus producing the current worldwide prevalence of complacency and impunity. Accordingly, in my official dialogue with states relating to allegations of torture or ill treatment, I routinely encounter all of these patterns of self-deception and denial, even in the face of compelling evidence. Indeed, as neurobiological and psychosocial research have demonstrated, in the face of unwelcome information, every single one of us is inescapably affected by the innate human tendency towards self-deception and denial, regardless of our education, our status, or our morality. This is not a malicious deviation, but a scientific fact devoid of moral connotations which cannot be changed. As an inherent part of human nature, it should not be condemned, but must be fully acknowledged and appropriately managed in order to prevent the widespread corruption, destruction, and cruelty which currently engulf the entire world. Most importantly, any global governance system seeking to fulfill the promises of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Charter, and the SDGs for 2030 must be based on a realistic, empirical, and science-based conception of human nature without moral idealization or judgmentalism, and must build normative and institutional frameworks specifically designed to mitigate the increasingly existential risks arising from human self-deception and denial of reality, not only in the area of human rights, but also of environmental protection, financial stability, and the prevention of pandemics. With this in mind, my report closes with a series of recommendations for global governance reform, which I will be happy to discuss further during our interactive dialogue. I thank you for your attention.
Doy las
I thank the distinguished Special Rapporteur for his statement. I now open the floor for questions or comments to Mr. Meltzer. I reiterate, as I said previously, that delegations should limit their comments to 2 to 3 minutes. Participants wishing to make comments and pose questions to the speaker are invited to use the dedicated speaker request form accessible on the chat board of the Interprify portal within the next 3 minutes, after which the list will be closed. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor. Well, we're going to begin the interactive dialogue, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco. Morocco, you have the floor.
Hello, do you hear me? Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, dear Madam. I have the pleasure of speaking on behalf of 6 countries leading the Convention Against Torture initiative, namely Chile, Denmark, Fiji, Ghana, Indonesia, and my own country, Morocco. We are a cross-regional group of states pursuing international collaboration towards universal ratification and effective implementation of the UN Convention Against Torture by 2024. We work to strengthen state institutions, policies, and practices through capacity building and technical advice, and enjoy support from a growing group of friends open to all UN member states. We would like to take this opportunity to invite all UN member states here today to join our initiative. Since CTI was launched in 2014, 17 new ratifications have been deposited, bringing the current total of to 171 state parties. We congratulate and welcome the newest state parties: Angola, Grenada, Kiribati, Samoa, the Sultanate of Oman, and St. Kitts and Nevis. These ratifications are significant. Yet, while the prohibition of the use of torture is jus cogens, not all states have joined the convention. CTI will continue raising awareness about the benefits of the convention and its optional protocol. CTI conducts extensive work with police and law enforcement services, as human rights-based policing is central to making the spirit of the convention a reality. Applying the convention fully reinforces trust between law enforcement and our citizens. Without trust, the ramifications are often severe and not easily reversible. Training, clear and transparent rules of conduct, ethnic and gender diverse recruitment, as well as independent accountability mechanisms are all features of effective police and justice systems. Exchange of knowledge and expertise on policing is a central focus of CTI's work, including our global seminar held in Copenhagen in October 2019, and our regional seminar hosted by Indonesia in November 2019. Police are and must continue to be our allies in the global fight against torture and ill treatment. We are committed to making important changes in this area, and we encourage every government to do likewise. In conclusion, we would like to thank the mandate holders for their important work and their continued support and cooperation with the CTI. I thank you very much, Madam.
I thank the Ambassador of Morocco for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you can hear me. The UK's strong opposition to the use of torture remains unchanged. Torture is an abhorrent violation of international human rights law and human dignity. Its impact on societies and individuals is devastating. The UK works closely with international partners to eradicate this abhorrent practice. Madam Chair, the UK is also committed to upholding our obligations under international law and calls upon countries to comply with their international legal obligation. The UK is a long-standing, strong, and vocal supporter of the optional protocol, and we encourage states which have not yet done so to ratify, sign, and implement the UN Convention Against Torture. Finally, Madam Chair, torture prevention is integral to the UK's rule of law programs, which aim to build security and stability overseas. The UK continues to support global torture prevention programs, including the work of the Association of the Prevention of Torture. The question I would ask today is, what can states do to widen the implementation of the optional protocol? Many thanks, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias a la...
Thank you very much to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark, followed by Switzerland. Denmark, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hope you can all hear me. Mr. Melzer, Denmark would like to start by thanking you for your continued efforts in the field in the fight against torture. In your most recent report, you shed light on psychological torture as part of the prohibition against torture in Article 3 of the Convention Against Torture. As it is a significantly overlooked aspect of the prohibition against torture, Denmark appreciates your effort to bring attention to this important matter. We are continuously alarmed by the prevalence of this phenomena, including during investigations. Hence, Denmark agrees with your invitation to states to actively support the ongoing process towards developing international guidelines on investigative interviewing and associated safeguards. Building on this, Denmark would like to ask you, Mr. Melzer, what other initiatives do you consider important in preventing and combating psychological torture? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland. You have the floor.
Chair, thank you. Switzerland would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his commitment and his report, which sheds light on the neurobiological factors that lead to torture and ill treatment. This report and the relevant recommendations have been drawn up in relatively abstract terms. This is certainly an important perspective to have a better understanding of the root causes of acts of torture and ill treatment. However, we also think that the respect for the prohibition of torture and ill treatment is also made up of many small steps. One of these steps is the work of experts that is underway to draw up international guidelines on inquiry interviews. Switzerland is also convinced that appropriate guidelines can make a significant contribution to the effectiveness of criminal justice and to strengthen respect for human rights. These guidelines are a specific angle on the issues raised in the report. Special Rapporteur, outside of international guidelines on inquiry interviews, where else do you see a specific need for international action to strengthen the prohibition on torture? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Switzerland, for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union, to be followed by the Czech Republic. The European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you. Professor Melzer, the European Union would like to start by thanking you for your work undertaken during the last year. The work is of the utmost importance, and we look forward to continuing the engagement and cooperation with you. The EU is firmly committed to ensure respect for the universal and absolute prohibition against torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And we appreciate your efforts to shed light on psychological torture and the prohibition thereof in Article 3 of the Convention. In your report, you argue that national practice tends to deny, neglect, misinterpret, or trivialize psychological torture, and that torture is generally understood to require the infliction of physical pain or suffering. You conclude that psychological torture occurs in a wide variety of contexts. In this regard, the EU would like to ask you, Professor Melzer, could you kindly elaborate on what states can do to identify practices that may amount to psychological torture. I thank you.
Muchas gracias a la Unión.
Thank you very much to the European Union for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Czech Republic, to be followed by France. The Czech Republic, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Czech Republic wishes to thank the chairs of the Committee Against Torture and the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture and the Special Rapporteur on Torture for their reports and statements. We welcome your presence at the third committee session. We would like to use this opportunity and congratulate Angola, Grenada, Oman, St. Kitts and Nevis for becoming the new state parties to the Convention Against Torture. Unfortunately, since autumn 2019, no new state party have joined the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Universal ratification of these two basic human rights treaties is necessary for the eradication of torture. We need Committee Against Torture as a standard-setting body closely cooperating with the state parties and Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture for control of detention places and for cooperation with the national preventive mechanisms. The Czech Republic strongly supports activities of the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. In 2019, we have welcomed here the growing number of visits in state parties' detention places by the subcommittee. Unfortunately, the reality in 2020 is completely different for obvious reasons. We hope the subcommittee will return quite soon to its regular activities, and we thank Professor Evans for answering our question on how are the national preventive mechanisms fulfilling their visits in detention places in 2020. We have studied with great interest the new report of the Special Rapporteur dealing with the factors conducive to torture and ill treatment. It is important to repeat that prohibition of torture is universally recognized and absolute and non-derogable. All human beings are in all situations without exception protected against torture. The prohibition of torture cannot be restricted even in war and other situations of public emergency. Still, we can read in the submitted report that torture and ill treatment continues to be practiced with impunity throughout the world. How can we, as individual countries and as international community, help to uproot this scourge? Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la representante de República Checa por su.
Thank you very much, the representative of the Czech Republic. I now give the floor to the representative of France, followed by the Russian Federation, and then Lebanon. France, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Special Rapporteur, chairs of the Committee Against Torture and of the Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture, France aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union and reiterates its support to the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. France would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his work, particularly his most recent report focused on the idea of psychological torture. France would also like to recall its commitment to fight against torture in all its forms, including its new forms that it has taken because of the emergence of new technologies. France also welcomes the work of the Committee Against Torture and of the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture, and calls on all member states to the Convention to cooperate with these bodies actively and in a complementary fashion contribute to documentation of cases of torture and to the fight against these crimes both nationally and internationally. France would also like to recall that, as stipulated by the Statute of Rome of the International Criminal Court, acts of torture are crimes against humanity when they are committed in the framework of a systematic or generalized attack against civilians. France calls on all member states to accede to the Convention Against Torture and to its optional protocol. In this connection, we do welcome the recent ratification or accession from Angola, Grenada, Kiribati, and Oman to the Convention. Thank you very much, Chair.
Gracias.
Thank you very much to the representative of France for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
from detainees during preliminary investigation. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias a la
Thank you very much to the representative of Lebanon for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Meltzer, for your work on this important issue. We take this opportunity to register our categorical rejection of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and punishment. As Secretary Pompeo stated on September 23rd, the human rights enshrined in our founding documents abhor the notion of torture in any form. America's values are universal values, and they are based on the sanctity and protection of individual rights. The United States played a leading role in enacting the Convention Against Torture, and we remain trailblazers in the campaign to end torture and related practices worldwide. We are staunch advocates for the rights of the victims of torture. We continue to provide support to the UN Voluntary Fund for the Victims of Torture and other programs that assist in the rehabilitation process, as well as advance the elimination of torture through effective awareness campaigns and human rights trainings for security and law enforcement officers. No society can be free, nor any individual secure when torture is permitted. We call on all countries to ensure their policies and practices conform to the Convention Against Torture, investigate credible claims of torture, hold violators accountable, and condemn nations that fail to do so. In China, more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims and others have been detained in internment camps in Xinjiang with credible reports of torture, forced labor, and involuntary sterilization. In Belarus, NGOs have documented over 500 cases of torture of those unjustly detained following public protests. In Venezuela, the UN fact-finding mission's September report concluded that there was a reasonable basis to conclude that the illegitimate Maduro regime committed systematic human rights violations, including torture, amounting to crimes against humanity. While we appreciate the Special Rapporteur's work, we disagree with many of your report's conclusions and recommendations as they relate to lawful U.S. practices that cannot reasonably be considered torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as references to our actions with regard to the Assange and Manning cases. Our question for you is, what steps can the international community take to help support documentation of reports of torture in order to promote accountability? Thank you.
Agradezco al distinguido representante de Estados Unidos por su intervención y
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for your statement. I now give the floor to the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Cruel and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Mr. Meltzer, to respond to the comments or questions posed. You have the floor.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank all the distinguished representatives of the states here represented for their questions and comments. I'm aware that this report that I have submitted is of a particular character. The representative of Russia has commented that it is too research-based, it's distant from reality, and that I should focus on practical aspects. Now, I would like perhaps to start by responding to this. I have been focusing on the practical aspects. In my mandate, I'm submitting hundreds of communications for individual cases of alleged torture per year. And about 1/3 of these communications never receive any response whatsoever. And I have to say that even the majority of the other responses I receive do not satisfactorily actually resolve the problems that have been addressed by these communications. I can see that we have a universal normative consensus, and I commend the efforts of states and initiatives such as the CTI for achieving the universal ratification of the conventions and the OPCAT. All of these, the optional protocol, all of these initiatives are very important and strengthen the normative consensus, which already exists, but obviously becomes stronger through these initiatives. That is important. The point of my report is that despite this normative consensus, we still have widespread practice of torture and ill treatment in multiple contexts and at multiple levels. There can be issues of psychological torture, but also simply ill treatment in police stations and the lack of investigation for these types of allegations. And so what I can see is that the system, the normative consensus is there, but it's not working in practice. It simply is not good enough what's happening on the ground. And now I'm not here to blame or finger point, because what I realize is there is no country that doesn't have weak spots. And so I've decided in this report to take a step back and to actually look at factors that we may not be routinely aware of when we discuss normative kind of regulation and implementation that might affect the way we implement these prohibitions. And what I can see that, again, I'm not going to identify any specific country, because it actually is the case with most countries that when I address in my mandates, in my capacity, a specific case and submit credible evidence that torture or ill treatment might have happened, the very least that should happen is a formal investigation, as is an obligation under Article 12 of the Convention Against Torture, and also arguably under a customary law and the other human rights treaties. But very often that does not happen. I receive blanket rejections, explanations that national institutions and national law are sufficient to prevent torture. When I express concern about legislative projects introducing impunity for torture or statutes of limitations or making it more difficult to prosecute torture, the responses I receive are just reassuring me that everything will be fine. I intentionally simplify a little bit, but I don't receive an actual practical engagement on these concerns that would actually lead to a resolution of these cases. I'm currently conducting a state consultation throughout the United Nations on the perception of governments of their own cooperation with my mandate, and I also invite states there to express concerns or make proposals on how this working relationship could be improved in case there is something on our side that perhaps doesn't work as it should. But I'm at the same time also evaluating statistically the responses of states to my country visit requests and my individual communications of the last 4 years. And I'll leave it extend a little bit back into the work of my predecessors, and to statistically evaluate that and compare it to the standards of cooperation set by the Human Rights Council in order to have a consolidated report in March to the Human Rights Council that will reflect the actual reality of how states cooperate with my mandate and how many cases have been resolved. And I'm not saying that states have to agree with the allegations transmitted, because there are allegations, but at the very least, they should, in each case, engage in a prompt and impartial investigation as required by the convention, and then report back to my mandate in detail as to the findings. In most cases so far, the responses I receive to communications are simply not living up to the standards set by the Council itself. And again, I'm not suggesting malicious intent. I think it's more that states have settled into a kind of relaxed into a mode of cooperation that has become almost ritualized, but where they're no longer actually resolving the cases as would be expected of these mechanisms. And I also would like to point out, and that's why my report is broader, the same issues have been observed by some of my colleagues in other mandates, which I'm obviously not reporting on, but we felt that we have to look into the more generic root causes for the failure of an excellent normative system with excellent mechanisms and excellent institutions that have been created by you, the states, in order to ensure compliance with the prohibition of torture and ill treatment and other human rights. And why does that fail in practice, even 75 years after the universal recognition of the prohibition of torture? And there we have to look a little bit further than just a lack of expertise or guidance. While I recognize that clearly these processes in developing guidance for non-coercive interviewing, for example, are crucial, because they will build the capacity of institutions to implement the prohibition and to train their law enforcement officers. And that's very important. But it is not sufficient, because what we also see is that very often judicial institutions, judicial mechanisms, the courts, the judges, trust the police more than they will trust the victims that report abuse. And very often they refuse to actually engage into the investigations that they should engage in, based on their personal relations, based on these patterns that I described in my report. So I think we should be honest with ourselves. It happens to all of us, also to us in our mandates, that we ignore certain facts in good faith, just because out of a routine on how mechanisms have been constructed. So I certainly did not want to stay theoretical with my report. My recommendations in the end are quite concrete if they are being implemented. The main focus would be that we need to have transparency and accountability in all exercise of government authority, judicial authority. What we see currently worldwide is a tendency towards more secrecy, towards prosecuting and even persecuting whistleblowers and persons that expose misconduct, including torture and ill treatment. And we're going in the wrong direction there. It is very important that there be a maximum of transparency, that secrecy or confidentiality be limited strictly to what needs to be withheld from the public in the interest of personal privacy and intimacy, and these types of aspects are very narrow questions of national security. But what we see by and large is that the argument of national security is overexpanded to impose secrecy on actual government misconduct, and the result is that we have impunity and a widespread complacency in the public. So I ask you to look with fresh eyes on my report, not as a report that criticizes states, but that intentionally bases itself on objective science. So it's not a moral issue, and puts a mirror in front of all of us, including the mandates, the experts, but also the government officials, look at in the mirror and see this is how we're functioning, and then build our institutions in order to mitigate the risks that result from our very human nature. And that includes certainly at the very core transparency, so the opposite of secrecy, and accountability in any case. So I thank you very much for your questions, your attention. I hope I responded to most, if not all, your questions in a satisfactory manner, and I look forward to continue the cooperation with you. And in closing, would simply also invite you to engage with the state consultation, which formally has ended today, but which I'm absolutely willing to extend a few weeks if there are states that still want to respond. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Back to you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Melzer for your participation in this interactive dialogue and your responses there. So, distinguished colleagues, we've heard the last speaker on this item. The committee will continue to hear statements by special procedure mandate holders and other experts this afternoon, 15th of October at 3 p.m., pursuant to our program of work. The meeting is adjourned. I thank you all and I wish you a good day. Thank you very much.
Gracias.